Tuning in to today's Drawing for Adults class. This class is offered as a partnership between the Ann Arbor District Library and the Ann Arbor Art Center. So today we are going to be sketching and shading with graphite. So I'm just going to go over a couple things about shading, and then I will go into a quick little demo on how to draw a still life. So I want to first just start out by showing some examples of works of art that we can see this use of shading and getting that nice transition of values in fairly well-known works of art. So that previous one was by Picasso. This is an example by M.C. Escher. Here's one by Albert Dürer, Leonardo da Vinci. These are incredible works of art. So if you have a set of drawing pencils, and if you don't have a set of drawing pencils, that's okay. But if you do have a set of drawing pencils, I just want to include this in this so that you kind of get an understanding of what each of the different pencils will do. So if you don't have a set of drawing pencils that don't have a variety of letters and numbers like this on there, that's okay. You probably do have this first one that's labeled here on the left called an HB pencil. So if you take a look at a pencil that you have just lying around, whether that's a Ticonderoga or even a mechanical pencil, most likely on the end of it, it actually does say HB, and it's probably somewhere close to that number 2, which we're really familiar with calling these pencils number 2 pencils, but they're also an HB pencil, and what that means is it's kind of the middle of the road. It's a standard pencil. It's not too hard. It's not too soft. It's the Goldilocks of pencils, if you will. So we have H pencils, we have B pencils, and we have also another one called an F pencil. So your H pencils is a harder pencil, meaning that when you press down with it, it's going to feel a lot harder. It's a much firmer kind of graphite, but also it's going to appear to be much lighter. Whereas a B pencil is going to be a lot softer. And so when you press down, you're going to feel that softness. You'll notice your pencil will dull really easily. You'll have to sharpen it more often than an H. And it will appear to be darker, whereas H's are lighter. So you can see here on the left side, we see the lighter kind of value ranges here. And then you see on the right side here, this softness, the darkness of that graphite known with a B. So as that number increases, it only intensifies those properties. So if it's softer, then the higher that number it goes, the softer it gets, also meaning the darker it gets. With an H, the higher that number goes, the lighter it gets, as well as the more hard it gets. Now, an F is a little different. An F is a fine pencil. It's going to be pretty similar to the H's, but maybe not quite as hard. So it's somewhere between an H and an HB. Now, if you're using charcoal, you could absolutely use charcoal for this study if you happen to have charcoal around. You also will find charcoal sometimes will have, be labeled as a 2B, a 4B, 6B, 8B, those kinds of things, but it also might just say soft, medium, hard. So now you know that the softer it is, the darker it's going to be. Whereas if you have a harder charcoal pencil, it's probably going to be a little bit more gray versus a black, soft pencil. So I mentioned the word value earlier, and what is value, right? We have to kind of discuss this, I think, in terms of shading. So value, it's one of the 7 elements of art. The other elements are things like shape, form, color, texture, space, line, and then we have value. So value deals with the lightness or darkness of a color or object. And so since we see objects and understand them because of how dark or light they are, value is really important to art. So I recommend you to practice drawing this little value scale here at the bottom. So fading from really dark to really light. Now, these are obviously divided into little sections, so you would kind of do one at a time, but you also want to be able to do this in a more fluid kind of motion where you easily transition from a 6 to a 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, where it's just completely empty. So going from black to white with your pencil and or charcoal or colored pencil or really anything that you can kind of do this. You can't really do this as easily with a marker, so if that's something you're thinking of doing, maybe save that for a different project. But for graphite and charcoal, colored pencils, pastels, this would all be a really great tool to use to create this nice transition of values. And that's what we want to see in art, or we want to at least have the ability to create those transition of values, even if we decide not to use a full value range in our artwork. So shading versus values. So shading is often the word that we really use to describe this technique. Shading is kind of similar, but shading is really just the darkening or coloring of an illustration or diagram with parallel lines or block of color. So it doesn't really describe that actual transition of values that we're talking about, but that's what most people will actually refer to it as shading. So it's not necessarily that. So not that I'm really that much of a stickler about using the correct terminology, but I just want to, raise a little bit of awareness here about using the correct words and terms to describe certain techniques in art, so that you're more easily able to describe the process in which you're creating your work of art. So we also do have value in color. While we're not really going to be focusing that much on color today, it's something that's important to note. So when you're using something like a colored pencil or a pastel, you're still able to apply value when using a different medium. So when using value in color, adding white to a color is mostly how you would tend to make a tint. So a tint, again, not to get too technical here, but that's the word that you use to describe when you make a color lighter versus a shade. Again, another way we're using that word shading isn't always the right term to use, but a shade is actually when you make a color darker. So navy is a shade of blue, just like pink is a tint of red. So a little different there between tints and shades. Now, chiaroscuro is a technique. I'm not going to touch too much on this, but this is when you're going to really have a lot of emphasis between those light and dark values. And so instead of having a lot of midtones, you're going to have this extreme contrast between your very, very light values and your very, very dark values. So this technique was actually developed during the Renaissance. You can look at a ton of Caravaggio's works, for example, such as this one, to really see what this technique looks like in a work of art. So there's several other ways of creating value. So hatching, cross-hatching, stippling, and scribbling or scumbling, sometimes that's called, are other ways of creating that kind of look of creating that value, those transitions. So for hatching, it's simply a bunch of straight lines that are parallel to each other. And the more lines you have closer together, the darker, of course, it's going to be as it fills in that space more. Versus as you keep going across this value scale here, you can see those lines are getting spaced further and further apart. Now, cross-hatching is going to be extremely similar, but instead of just having a bunch of vertical straight lines, you see some crisscross lines happening. So lines kind of running perpendicular to each other, but same thing in terms of spacing it out. Same thing as far as space with the stippling, scribbling, they're all going to be the same kind of thing. It's just using a different kind of mark as you are creating this kind of value. Stippling is made with little dots, scribbling is made with little scribbles. So value is used to help create form. So I mentioned form, or hopefully I mentioned form earlier when I was listing the elements of art. I may have forgotten that one, I'm not sure, but form is one of the elements of art, and so we use value to help create that sense of form. And so because the reason why we do that is because it's used when showing highlights and shadows on an object. So if you want to really give that illusion of drawing a 3D object on a 2D space, meaning your 2D space being your piece of paper, then it's really helpful to be able to use value to create the use of highlights and shadows to help create the illusion of a 3D object. So let's do some practicing. So I recommend pressing pause on this video so that you can take time to do a quick little sketch of this. This is going to be, you'll find, a little different than drawing it if you had these actual pairs in person with you. So these are obviously a photograph of pairs that I found, and but go ahead and practice shading this with your pencil. And a sheet of paper. And after you finish that, really look and notice, okay, did I overshade? That's often the thing. We want to shade everything in. We want to just fill it totally in. And then we realize that we accidentally forgot to leave our highlights. So we want to make sure that we leave space, that we leave that white space on your paper for highlights. Another great idea, if you happen to have this, is if you have a sheet of construction paper or any other kind of paper that's toned, meaning it has some kind of tint or color to it, that can be great if you have a white colored pencil sitting around, or a white crayon even, or white pastel, or white piece of charcoal. And because that actually gives you the ability to add in that white rather than just relying on maintaining the white of the paper to be clear and free from any graphite or charcoal. That can be hard to do sometimes, so it's nice to be able to do this. Now, if you don't have that, no worries. Your eraser is going to be a super handy tool to have on hand, because you can actually erase the parts of graphite, especially. It erases pretty easily. I will say that when you're using a softer pencil, such as a B, you'll find it's a little bit more challenging to erase, but you can still do it. Charcoal is erasable as well, but a little tricky to get it fully erased, but you can definitely pull out some highlights using your eraser. So give that a try, and then we'll move on to a more in-depth project where you're actually setting up actual objects on a table in your home, preferably with a great light source.
All right, so if you haven't already grabbed your objects that you want to draw, I do recommend grabbing a few different things, at least 3 different objects of different sizes and shapes. So maybe some that are more curvy while some are more geometric. And then we're just gonna start with a light pencil sketch. And for this, we are just laying out, what I'm doing right now is kind of drawing actually just the center line of all the objects. That's what those vertical lines are, not the edges of the objects, they're actually the center line of the objects. And that is just helping me actually just space things out so that I make sure that my objects are in the right position without having to worry about drawing and erasing everything over and over again. Now, drawing the individual objects is super important, but I have to pay attention to that negative space. So I'm looking at that little shape, I just highlighted it in red there, and I'm looking at the space, the shape that's created in between the objects just as much as I'm looking at the actual objects in order to draw them accurately and in the right space and relation. I can keep the in relation to each other. I can draw the bottle here perfectly, but if it's not in the right spacing, in terms of how close it is to the other object, then even though it might be exactly what it looks like, I haven't drawn it actually in the right place, so then I have to redraw it. Yeah, and speaking of redrawing things, I can see that my coffee mug was kind of in the wrong spot there and still is. So I'm working on adjusting that to get that in the correct proportion, scale, all of that to the original coffee mug. All right, so now it's time for me to clean up my edges to get everything a little bit smoother. But this is a pretty good sketch, so I think I'm ready to go on to shading. So you can tell this is actually looks really dark for some reason. I would, not probably be able to get as dark as what it's looking if I were using regular graphite, but if I were using charcoal, that would be pretty accurate. So what I'm layering in right now is my darkest values that I see when I'm looking at my still life. From there, I can move on to the midtones, so you can see me layering that part in. You absolutely don't have to necessarily go in that kind of order of layering in your darks and kind of gradually lifting it out, but I think it is a good way of approaching layering in your values. So One thing I want to point out is that it's really helpful to put your objects near a window or near a lamp or something so that you have a nice direct light source. If you don't have a really direct source of light hitting your objects, you're not going to see as much tonal contrast, which means that your drawing won't have as much tonal contrast. You can, however, always kind of fudge it a little bit and pretend like it's a little bit more dramatic, like your darks are all a little bit darker and your lights are all a little bit lighter. So pay attention to the objects that you're looking at and really look at the value. Try to decide. Now, when you're drawing this in black and white, it's hard when you're looking at objects of color. So try to compare, okay, is this part of my object darker, that's green maybe, for example, is that darker than this dark blue? And just compare. One thing that can be helpful is if you take a photo and edit it on your phone into a more like monochromatic kind of setting, and then you can really compare values that way. Eventually, it'd be good, of course, to train your eye so that you're really seeing those differences without having to take a photo and editing it to black and white. But if you don't have that option, that's all right. So I am just adding in some shadows. Don't forget the shadows underneath your objects, but feel free to, of course, you're always welcome to play this video over and over again to help you really figure out kind of the process of drawing this.